40 miles to the south, the 2nd Marine Division was faking a landing on another coast in order to deter Ushijima from rushing reinforcements to the real landing beaches, where 4 divisions, 2 Army and 2 Marine, were already rushing inland from the 8-mile stretch of beach. Okinawa's width at that point, just south of its narrowest neck, is some 7 miles to the Pacific shore. On their way across, cutting the island in two, American units encountered 2 airfields, including Kadena, Captain Kojo's responsibility until the accidental explosion that drove him to a hospital. Both fields were less than half a mile from the landing beach, but American planners, with their experience of ferocious Japanese island defences, had scheduled their capture for the 3rd day. Defended only by a recently formed regiment of support troops with scant combat training, they fell easily the first morning. One Marine noticed that after the tumultuous American bombardment, nothing was alive. Not a goddamn grasshopper or snake or fly. On the way to the fields. The defenders of the slightly more northern Yomitan airfield included Okinawan conscripts who had been issued uniforms but no arms. Shortly after it was secured, a Japanese Zero appeared directly overhead, almost transfixing the Marines below with its rising sun insignia. The pilot made a graceful landing, apparently with important papers from the mainland, then taxied across the field, climbed from his cockpit, and walked toward an airport building before realizing who the men gathered there were. They shot him as he tried to run back to his plane. The expected counterattack by a powerful parachute force didn't materialize. "This is hard to believe," wrote a correspondent who had covered previous landings, while bulldozers prepared to clear the runways of wrecked Japanese planes and clever dummies of sticks, straw, and cloth. By nightfall, Marine strike planes began landing, the first to operate from official Japanese soil since the war began. That evening, a Marine artillery battery was fully ashore and ready to fire from a position near the beach. The men began digging in for the night, but found they were on solid coral that couldn't be dented. We had to hope for no incoming fire, and luckily there wasn't any. Americans who reconnoitred the empty Japanese fortifications, the excellently positioned caves, gun emplacements and pillboxes, dug over the course of 6 months by Captain Kojo's 24th Division, realized they were even luckier than they'd thought. Despite the courageous feats of the Navy's underwater demolition teams, many landing craft were stranded for hours on coral reefs about 1,000 yards out. Sitting ducks for enemy field artillery and heavy machine guns, had they been where originally positioned. And despite the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment in the long Pacific campaign, only civilian buildings had been demolished. Virtually intact defense works at the airfields and beaches testified to the unrealistic value Americans placed on weight of metal and explosives, as well as to the Japanese skill in choosing and fortifying sites. If Ushijima hadn't lost the 9th Division, those sites wouldn't have been abandoned. Captain Kojo's replacement would have led a charge with professional ruthlessness and a poised, largely unharmed battalion from his original position above the beach. The hardest part of all was trudging in, an American remembered with understatement. The water was waist-deep. If we'd had to fight our way in, it would have been a job instead of a cinch. In other words, the invaders would surely have been the prey Kojo had envisioned. The American Army, designated the 10th, had 541,866 men at its disposal, more than the Okinawan civilian population at that time, and almost 5 times more than the defending force. The smaller American landing force also represented a considerable numerical advantage over the Japanese, even beefed up by Okinawan conscripts. By nightfall, some 60,000 of the 10th Army's 183,000 assault troops were ashore, together with much armour, artillery and supplies, and 15,000 service troops. The price was a fraction of what had been expected. 28 killed, most by kamikaze crashes on land, 27 missing, 104 wounded. Although kamikaze crashes into the sea had also squeezed the legs of some men in landing craft, hard enough to crush their testicles, which had to be surgically removed, L-Day had indeed brought a trace of love. Marine losses in particular were trifling compared to previous landings. 9 killed, 100 wounded, including Alexander Franks, whose platoon landed in a roaring Amtrak amphibious tractor. When his Amtrak at last headed in, Franks was much relieved to see no incoming shells, and even more so to see no one falling around him when the vehicle finally stopped and he ran up the pebbly beach. He dashed up a little rise and dived to his stomach on top. A shell exploded just to his left, killing the man next to him. Franks realized he too was hit when he couldn't get up again. It's an awful thing to say, but I think it was one of our own, a shortfall, because there were still no shells coming from the Japs. My first thought is, am I going to lose my leg? And then, I'm alive and I'll be going home. I'm deeply sorry to leave my buddies. I'm deeply sorry for them, but there's nothing I can do for them anymore. That new guy right next to me, 2 feet away, is dead, and I'm still alive. Still alive. And after the shot of morphine from the courseman, I realize my arm and leg are still on me, so I probably won't be a cripple. For Masahide Ota, the 20-year-old native of Kume Island who'd been appointed one of the 3 adjutants to the principal of his prestigious school, L-Day was almost unbearably exciting. Perhaps because it was assumed that the normal school, so close to the 32nd Army's headquarters in the tunnel under Shuri Castle, must have been mobilized earlier. It was actually done only the day before the landing, March 31st. By that time, over 20,000 mostly teenage Okinawans were serving in the Home Guard. Although not all the boys of the island's various middle schools were among the conscripted, the normal school's teachers and entire enrollment of 360 students were taken into the 1,500 boy corps called Blood and Iron Scouts for the Emperor. The top 22 students were formed into a subunit bearing the immensely proud name of a historical figure who had sacrificed his and his family's lives to protect the Emperor. Those enviable ones, including bright, diligent Ota, were assigned, sublimely, to staff intelligence at 32nd Army Headquarters. The students' years of military training had included no practice firing, not even of small arms. Now a rudimentary short-pants uniform was distributed, but there was no time for any substantive preparation. But the second-class privates were heady with the thrill of being near the highest-ranking army officers on an observation platform at Shuri Castle. Looking down at the huge enemy landing, the boys delighted in the idiotic massing of so many ships marked for the bottom. Ota's unqualified expectation of quick total victory was further heightened when he saw the kindly, masterful General Ushijima calmly surveying the epic scene. The boys believed exactly what they'd been told, that Imperial General Headquarters had been clever enough to lure the large enemy force there in order to destroy it in one go. As one of their teachers put it, the noose into which the massive American fleet had been drawn would now be deftly closed. Ota felt a surge of exhilaration as he observed the stirring spectacle below. What an honour to participate in the glorious task of rapidly liquidating the sinister foe. He itched for his first assignment for staff intelligence. Dick Whittaker was among the rich beneficiaries of the nearly unopposed landing. Had the assault force been met with the furious counter-attack originally planned, he'd have been rushed in to replace one of the profusion of casualties, with a good chance of being killed or badly wounded then and there. As it was, the first wave of Americans penetrated so fast and deep that by the time he arrived, in the third wave an hour later, their greatest need was not more bodies, but more material. The unimagined swiftness of the advance caused an instant crisis in supplies. Whittaker's replacement draft was among 5,000 Marines formed into work details. As his Amtrak had circled in preparation for landing, he fell asleep. Probably he'd conclude years later, after taking a college course in psychology, in reaction to an overload of stress and apprehension. But now he worked through it by lifting and lugging, at which all Marines were old hands. Floodlights were rigged on the long beachhead so that unloading from landing craft could continue throughout the night, except for relatively rare interruptions when the men took cover from Japanese scouting planes. They bitched in good old military language. Fuck it, they didn't come to Okinawa to unload ships. The Marine Corps' invincibility had been confirmed. Whitaker believed himself invincible too. Some of the older married men might have been happy to stay where they were, but the young bucks wanted off that goddamn beach where the fucking relentless fleas were a lot worse than the stupid Japanese army. They wanted combat, to pull their triggers, become heroes, cop some good Jap souvenirs. On the fourth day, 6 of them took advantage of some slack time to improvise a little scouting party. That was against regulations. No one in command would know where they were if they happened to get in trouble. But the ease with which the little nips were being pushed back kept death an abstraction. A patch of woods farther inland had been secured days before, which is to say enough cleaned of the enemy for combat units to push on. "But hey, get that!" shouted one of the party, pointing to a small rise a few hundred yards from the beach. Whitaker's first sight of a live Japanese soldier, of any living Japanese, brought a rush of excitement. There was the object of all his training, of the whole massive effort on the island. Joining the firing at the titillating target until its sloppy helmet disappeared over the ridge, he felt revved up even more. The work parties were broken up a few days later, and their members trucked to frontline units as replacements, but Whitaker saw few real targets even there. He was assigned to F. Fox Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Marine Division's 29th Regiment, which had advanced far north by the time he joined it. With the company's fighting up there almost over, American bullets now caused its worst wounds. An airstrike was requested one day, when Whitaker's new platoon encountered a pocket of resistance on a mop-up patrol. The men were told to mark their own positions by making ground panels of ponchos and anything else easily seen from above. Several F-4Us soon appeared, the celebrated Corsairs that had already demonstrated their enormous value in the north, where Japanese artillery pieces fired once and pulled back into concealed emplacements on steep hillsides, making them almost invulnerable to naval gunfire. The Corsair, which carried more armament than a B-29, may have been the best close ground support aircraft ever designed, able to bomb or strafe as close as 200 yards to delighted friendly troops. But one of the gull-winged buttes on that raid missed or misread the ground panels and strafed the wrong side, killing one Marine and wounding others. To be the target of one's own magnificent weapons was doubly anguishing. Hugging the ground in terror with the rest of his platoon, Whitaker viewed the great Corsair as a savage monster spitting murderous fire. No list has been compiled of men killed and wounded on Okinawa by own fire, but it would surely run to hundreds, perhaps thousands, to which should be added those torn and blown apart by bulldozers, cranes, steam winches, and aviation fuel handled by young men necessarily in a hurry. The industrial accidents of a huge, extremely hazardous enterprise run under supreme stress, with what otherwise would be called inordinate recklessness. The proportion of such deaths grew as armies acquired heavier machinery, more volatile fuel, deadlier armament, and more powerful explosives. And in the field, it was impossible to have so many youths, with so many never-predictable weapons, without constant accidents and mistakes. Back south on Sugarloaf Hill, where Whitaker would find himself in about 3 weeks, a second lieutenant would lose a beautiful 18-year-old kid, a real fine, decent Marine, when a tank shell aimed at a Japanese target bounced off a tree stump and tore open his chest. On Little Ihaya Island, 50 miles north of Okinawa, Marines would be killed by rocket fire from ships that didn't know they were on the beach. It was inevitable that American bullets, grenades, mortar shells, artillery shells, and even flamethrowers would cut down American boys all over Okinawa because, as one veteran would put it, combat is just too confusing for any kind of count of who killed whom. Peacetime terrorist actions that take a single precious life are rightly emblazoned in headlines and abhorred. Infinitely worse losses on Okinawa were never mentioned in print, or even to the families concerned, because few officers were willing to write that their men had fallen to own fire. More than will ever be known, in the summary of one dismayed lieutenant, which is as accurate as any. 11. The North. The first days went so well for the Americans that staff officers wondered whether Ushijima was a genius or a fool. Even if he now tried to turn and make a stand, a seasoned correspondent predicted, the campaign would cost fewer casualties than any in the Pacific. Everyone asked where the Japs were. Cloud cover had interfered with pre-landing reconnaissance flights, masking their positions, which remained hidden by nets and fresh branches. In fact, the heart of the 32nd Army was just where Colonel Yahara's last plan had put it, waiting in its fortifications in the southern eighth of the island. The first strong line lay less than 8 miles below the southernmost landing beach and only about a dozen above the island's southern tip. The 2 army divisions that fought south from the landing encountered its outer edge toward the end of the first week, in valleys and draws protected by minefields and covered by well-camouflaged field guns. But although fortified hills dominating the lines of advance made them hard to take, the stubborn resistance there was considered normal. The honeymoon would be truly over only when the main body of the defence was reached. Meanwhile, the 2 Marine divisions were still enjoying a relative holiday. The first was encountering much less resistance than expected while taking a large portion of the island's centre. The 6th hurried north in what seemed a cakewalk, especially with Yomitan and Kadena airfields already launching close support strikes to speed it. Yahara and Ushijima hadn't expected those fields to fall so quickly. When startling numbers of American planes began operating from them almost immediately, they had rueful second thoughts and wondered whether to counterattack. Japanese regret at having given up the fields so easily, a consequence of the decision to not defend the beaches after the loss of the 9th Division, was deepened by belated recognition that the enemy's quick capture of Karama Reto, a cluster of 9 mountainous islands about 15 miles west of Naha, was bringing more trouble. Those little islands had fallen during the week before the Okinawa landing, Ushijima having transferred most of their garrisons to Okinawa in the belief that they wouldn't interest the enemy. Easily defeating their few hundred remaining defenders, the Americans put them to immediate use as anchorages for repair ships and bases for patrol planes that would sink tens of thousands of tons of merchant shipping. They also became the final depots in the vast supply routes stretching from California. A bonus was disarming a potentially serious threat to those routes. The Karamas had been a base for 250 Japanese speedboats armed with heavy depth charges that were to have severed the American supply lines with suicide charges at the larger ships. The little trap now failed. The tiny one-man boats were found in well-camouflaged coves, some being readied for surprise attacks they'd never make, others destroyed by their maintenance crews. Another surprise for the Americans was the bodies of some 15 native women and children strangled by grieving husbands and fathers to save them from a worse fate at the hands of the invaders. Altogether, over 500 civilians died on the Karamas, including many who were sent to meet the invaders when the Japanese force melted away. Serious thought about that tragedy by the American 10th Army staff would have helped lessen the larger one coming on Okinawa itself. Other suicide craft berthed along the rough coasts of Okinawa's north were also about to be disabled, as the 6th Marine Division rapidly advanced to occupy its remote ruggedness. The approximately 50 by 8 mile strip of rocky terrain north of the landing beaches contained 2/3 of Okinawa's territory, but less than a quarter of its population. Apart from the Motobu Peninsula, which jutted like a large spur into the East China Sea, it was an inaccessible and essentially uninhabited mountain spine running northwest to the tip. Most of it was distinctly poorer than the south in 1945, even on the coastal roads where almost everyone lived. On the evening after the landing, a Marine detachment stopped after advancing a spectacular 4 miles from its landing site along the West Coast Road, a dirt track like most of the island's arteries. The troops were some 5 days ahead of schedule, and veterans of earlier campaigns exchanged nervously joyful expressions of disbelief. Where were the Japs? Would their trap be really diabolical, or was it possible that all Okinawa was going to be a picnic? Still, the Americans cherished the most pleasant letdown of their lives. Some initiates to combat wondered about the veterans' talk and the war films. "Holy shit," a medical corpsman happily asked himself. "Is all that hell and heroism stuff just more myth?" The columns advanced up the coastal roads with the East China Sea on one side, terraced hills on the other, and no sign of snakes. Much worse had been expected of the island, as well as its defenders. The pre-landing briefings had warned about all sorts of horrible results, from a microbe in the water that caused liver fluke, schistosomiasis, as well as about woods teeming with venomous adders, more frightening to some than the enemy. Habu snakes in particular were said to be a constant peril, but very few Americans would encounter one, now or later. Some of those who did see snakes, especially after living days or weeks on cold rations, would make meals of their broiled meat. Many men had already begun throwing away the puttees they'd been admonished to wear, together with their gas masks and, occasionally, even their helmets. Too heavy and not effective against bullets anyway. Anything to lighten the loads on their backs. So far, Okinawa had none of the sinister quality ascribed to it by the pre-invasion intelligence. On that afternoon of April 2nd, Marines had taken photographs of the scenery, including gently curving white sand beaches below the coast road. The spring day remained clear and pleasant when the sun went down, but all were extremely tired after marching very hard on very little sleep since the eve of the invasion. A unit that had started setting up in a cabbage patch was so tired and so relaxed that the men took their time digging their foxholes for the night, and were stunned by sudden fire from Japanese howitzers in a hill above. Of course they'd been lectured to take cover fast whenever shelling started. No, before it started. But newcomers to combat saw the whole of their boot camp and infantry training as nothing compared to this terrible reality. "I never repeated that mistake again," one of the targets would remember about his laziness in digging then. "On every one of my 80 evenings after that, I first dug my foxhole, then took a crap or had something to eat." The first rounds whistled over their heads and landed in the sea, but unseen Japanese gunners instantly adjusted their range to hit jeeps and inflict casualties. Although a patrol sent into the hill managed to silence the howitzers before midnight, shock and fear kept most of the men awake during the night, while corpsmen tended the wounded. The same unit was more heavily shelled 3 nights later, when a nearby radio man was shot while his microphone switch was open. Other members of the group heard him calling for help for hours. "Come and get us! We're pinned down! Help us out of here!" Volunteers were trucked to where they might outflank the Japanese from behind. They climbed a hill, each with a hand on the belt of the man in front to keep from getting lost in the dark and the difficult terrain. Digging in at the top, they were told not to leave their foxholes. Anyone who did might be taken for a Japanese infiltrator. No one slept during the remainder of that night. Everyone fired at every movement. In the morning, 2 Americans were dead of own fire even before the others set out to neutralize the enemy artillery. Each night, as they pushed north, American battalions settled in whenever possible on high ground, where they employed an updated version of the wagon circle, setting up machine guns and barmen on the position's outer ring. As an extra precaution, thin wires were strung some 50 to 70 yards out from the perimeter, across the footpaths leading down from the hills. Trip flares were rigged to go off when those wires were touched. In such a position a few nights later, a radio operator's heart skipped a beat when a voice with a Japanese accent suddenly whispered into his earphones, "Americans die!" Then the line went dead. To be cut off from regimental headquarters for an entire night was considered an unacceptable danger. The operations officer had no alternative but to send out a communications sergeant to lay a new line. One observer never felt sorrier for anyone before or since than he did for that man. Headquarters were a mile away, the night was black, Japanese were obviously in between, and he didn't know the location of other trigger-happy Marine outposts. I think I'd have asked for a company of infantry to surround me. But the self-possessed sergeant took just 2 riflemen and 2 of his communications specialists into the terrifying blackness where, they were certain, the same Japanese who had cut the line were waiting behind rocks, rifles poised, for the squeak of a roll reeling out a telephone wire to tell them when to shoot. Those slight episodes among thousands suggest that the push north was easy, only in comparison to what would follow it. The luckiest units raced up the coastal roads at the speed of a motorized unit, sometimes actually in vehicles, still elated by the scantiness of the enemy fire. Some men found it, like a walk in the country, a picnic, or, in a correspondent's richer image, a house that was expected to contain vicious gunmen but turned out to be only haunted. The luckier companies were accompanied by a destroyer escort or smaller ship steaming north at their pace to provide extra firepower from close offshore. Some Marines hooted at anyone who tried to warn them that Japs were savage fighters. Even when advance units entered Nago at the neck of the Motobu Peninsula, the largest town above the landing beaches, with a population of 10,000, they rarely met more than rifle fire. Other companies took only very scattered rifle, machine gun and mortar fire as they tramped ahead in single file, scouting the pine-covered hills and the terraces where the natives struggled to feed themselves. More harassment than serious opposition, the fire came from the hills or from behind sharp bends in the narrow twisting roads of that walking campaign. But unlucky units that happened to encounter defensive positions had to work and fight as hard as anywhere. A veteran of island campaigns assured a medical corpsman that the Japs were hopeless shots, except at long range. During the first 5 days, the same corpsman saw 5 Marines go down from single shots to the heart or head. After 8 men in the platoon of a machine gunner named Melvin Hecht were killed and 9 wounded on April 14th and 15, Hecht proclaimed, "I only have God to thank for being alive." In another unit, 4 volunteers to cross a difficult ridge were picked off one by one as they tried. 2 were killed, 1 crippled for life. The lucky one took shrapnel in every part of his body, including his testicles. Incidents like those prompted the commander of one Marine regiment to call the northern operation as difficult as I can conceive. I wonder how it was accomplished. But the spotty resistance was better summed up by a young communications man in that regiment named Norris Buchter. There were lots of very serious moments up there in the north. There were units shot to shreds. The whole thing seemed easy only later, looking back after what we went through in the south. Colonel Takehito Udo commanded the defense. Unlike General Ushijima, his classmate at the Imperial Military Academy, Udo was considered bullying and ineffectual. The local population quietly despised him. Udo's 2,500 men assigned to defend 436 square miles revealed the slight importance Ushijima placed on holding the northern 2/3 of Okinawa's territory, where his predecessor originally thought to organize the bulk of the defense. Moreover, the Udo force consisted of bits and pieces of various groupings, including 60 survivors of Toyama Maru, delivered to him in pitiful shape a week after the sinking. Udo himself had been the senior officer aboard. When the survivors finally arrived on Okinawa, they struck civilians as stragglers without even fighting a battle. Their condition, uniforms blackened with oil, heads bandaged, skin terribly swollen, surprised the islanders no more than their attempts to avoid attracting attention, so that no one would learn what had happened to the ship and 9/10 of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. But Udo had an intimate knowledge of the tough terrain, including a mountain retreat that towered on the Okinawan scale to 1,500 feet. It was protected by well-placed outposts with good communications to his headquarters and a relatively adequate supply of mortars and machine guns, in addition to well-hidden field guns and converted naval cannon. Some of his works confounded Americans for days. Artillery emplacements dug into mountainsides were equipped with tracks used for rolling out the guns for a few quick rounds, then immediate withdrawal into the camouflage of surrounding vegetation. When we finally took the territory, one Marine remembered. We'd find tremendous devastation all around, but the gun inside still intact. Distant, demanding Udo's own redoubt was high on Yaidake Mountain, which commanded the entire Motobu Peninsula, the only area he planned to defend in earnest. Covered by pine trees and a thick undergrowth of vines and brambles, Yaidake also concealed deep valleys that had to be crossed on the way to the top. Its defenders numbered roughly 2,000, most of the entire force. The most menacing to the Americans were several hundred soldiers manning a battery of heavy guns positioned on a steep face of the mountain. The colonel supervised his operations from a mat on the floor of his headquarters, where 3 local women waited on him, to the disgust of some of his non-commissioned officers. Native accounts pictured fear in his eyes as he complained about the impossibility of waging modern war without air support. Marines attacked the sprawling mountain from 2 sides during the second week of the campaign, while American ships and planes pounded the heights. That was the start of 4 fierce days of fighting, during which the commander of the Japanese heavy gun detachment became convinced the time was ripe to fire and frequently telephoned Udo for permission, but received no clear answer. After their Herculean labour of dragging the guns through the jagged terrain up to their vantage point, the gunners now suffered frustration. Americans discovered the position and attacked it heavily before it could do its full damage, while elsewhere on the mountain, violent clashes were taking place that required Marines to climb sheer cliffs under fire and engage in hand-to-hand combat on heavily forested ridges. One Japanese 75mm gun had much more success than the heavier ones, emerging from its cave to fire with great accuracy, then withdrawing quickly enough to escape destruction by American naval gunfire, artillery, bombs, and napalm. Udo counterattacked with his infantry only toward evening, when it was too close to nightfall for the Marines to risk mounting expeditions into the dangerous foothills, especially since their leadership was uncharacteristically wavering. The commander of the 29th Regiment, a rigid colonel who clung to ways learned in the First World War, had trained his men so severely on Guadalcanal that many felt worn out. Even after he was relieved on April 10th, the results of his stodgy planning showed on Yaidake. But after bitter hand-to-hand fighting for the peak, the full mountain was more or less taken on April 16th, leaving no more objectives remotely as difficult anywhere in the north. By that time, other Marine units had already reached Rocky Cape Hedo at Okinawa's northern tip. Hiding somewhere on the Motobu Peninsula, Udo became an object of contempt to other Japanese, who knew neither his whereabouts nor why he hadn't died honorably at his headquarters. Other survivors formed small guerrilla groups that hid in Motobu's mountainous forests and elsewhere in the barely inhabited north, eluding American patrols. Young Okinawan soldiers who had been conscripted on the eve of the battle served those groups both as scouts and as small bands of their own, their operations much more effectively commanded by a Captain Haruo Murakami than by the disliked Colonel Udo. A graduate of the Imperial Military Academy 1 year after Tadashi Kojo, Murakami shared Kojo's severe bearing, total dedication to military interests, and supreme confidence in ultimate victory, and his self-acquired expertise in guerrilla warfare made him more respected than many of his fellow regular officers. When Udo arrived one rainy night at a Murakami camp in civilian clothes, and what was considered an unfitting manner, he found a sign posted at the captain's headquarters. UDO's defeated little remnant gang not admitted. On April 20th, the commander of American operations in the north declared it secure. The flag raisers at 6th Division headquarters in Nago included a detachment from G. George Company of the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Regiment, apparently because the company, having moved rapidly up the West Coast Road, made a final exploratory patrol down the East Coast to ensure the collapse of enemy resistance. G222, the company's designation in military shorthand, had suffered only 2 battle fatigue casualties during the weeks of routing scattered groups of riflemen in their path. Their toughest battle had occurred when a hunter-killer squadron of American carrier-based planes repeatedly bombed and strafed them in the belief they were Japanese. the 6th Division as a whole counted almost 2,000 Japanese bodies, compared to their own casualties of 236 dead and 1,061 wounded, roughly the kill ratio that would prevail during the full campaign. Compared to Marine experiences on other islands, as well as what had been expected here, the 3 weeks had been a cinch. One infantry battalion had marched all the way up the western coast road to the northern tip without suffering a single casualty. With the April 25th pronouncement that organised resistance had ended in the north, the 6th Marine Division turned to mopping up patrols and to savouring military life's little pleasures in the field, cleaning weapons, taking photographs, picking up toothpaste and cigarettes at the Red Cross tent, sacking in whenever possible during the days of heavy rain, and working on tans during the sunny ones. Manly recreation also beckoned. Ball games were organised, first of all football, because we were young, trained, and spoiling for a fight, as one man put it. Soon many were hurrying to certain premises near the village of Unten. It was, in that straight-laced time, hardly a common practice of the US Marine Corps to run a brothel, but there were reasons for an exception here. Of all the Pacific islands on which the Marines had fought, this was the first with a large civilian population, including many attractive women and girls. It seemed sensible to try to avoid venereal disease and get rid of camp followers, a sprinkling of whom had begun trading themselves for food. It also seemed a good idea to keep the men from wandering into the villages and to prevent rape, of which there had already been some complaints. Unten, a site of captured nests for PT boats and midget submarines, was on the Motobu Peninsula, 15 miles north of 6th Division headquarters. The volunteer girls worked in a large, well-cleaned house, putting in long hours and making very good money by local standards. The customers, too, had to put in considerable time, standing first in a long line to buy 3 yen 30-cent chits in scrip and condoms from corpsmen at a table, then in a shorter one at the entrance to the house. They waited again inside, now in little cubicles, while a madame assigned their partners. One older man, of 26, waited on his cubicle's cot until a girl entered who looked 13. He gestured for her to go back out and send in an older colleague with more curves, but she returned with the madame, who told him to take it or leave it. He took. The existence of the cat house was, of course, unannounced and unacknowledged, but the regiment's chaplains got wind of it and protested the disgrace. "If my men want to fuck, that's what they're going to do," countered the regimental commander with modern broad-mindedness. But the best recreation was fantasizing about getting the hell off Okinawa. Having secured the north, the victorious Marines told themselves that their job was done and that our chances of being alive on VJ Day looked a little more promising, an infantryman wistfully calculated. On clear nights in late April, some could make out the flickering of muzzle blasts 40 or 50 miles south, from where a distant rumble also sometimes reached them. Private Eugene Sledge, who would write the great American memoir of the battle, tried to convince himself it was thunder, although he knew better. Since the first week after the landing, all 6th Division Marines had heard rumours about difficulties in the south, but they had only a vague impression of what those difficulties really were, and no idea whatever that many Japanese soldiers were still improving their fortifications there. It was never more true than among the happy Marines contriving to make life more comfortable for themselves in the sparsely inhabited north, that men in the ranks rarely think beyond each day's assigned duties and possible perks. Some eagerly spread the only half-joking rumour that they were going back to Guam soon, then going home for Christmas. In fact, they'd be going to the Great Shuri defence line before the end of April. Their fighting had hardly begun. 12. Civilians flee. Although Okinawan civilians were far from Washington's greatest concern, their fate wasn't entirely ignored. The War Department, aware that this was the first time its Pacific forces would encounter a large, unfriendly but non-combatant population, sought to minimize their inevitable casualties and lighten their inescapable distress while pursuing its main interests of keeping them from hindering American efforts or aiding the Japanese. American servicemen themselves could not be informed of anything about civilians until their destination was revealed, which happened only when they were almost there. 4 months earlier, at Christmas 1944, Okinawa's dot on a large map of the Pacific at the 6th Marine Division's bulletin board on Guadalcanal had a heavy smudge from countless fingers that had touched it while men speculated about their next destination. But none knew officially until they were at sea in their troop transports or landing craft, when a brochure distributed during pre-landing briefings made the first mention of the simple, polite, law-abiding Okinawans. They were not warlike, it informed, and they resent the high and mighty ways of the Japanese from the Big Islands to the north. Each of the 4 American divisions that landed on Easter Sunday was allocated 70,000 pounds of rice and soybeans, and instructed to protect as many civilians as feasible by handing them over to separate military government, Milgov units, composed of doctors, corpsmen, quartermasters, civil administrators, and engineers for building detention camps. Small teams of them were attached to the fighting units and moved up behind the advance, with drinking water and rudimentary medical supplies for the sick and wounded. The Milgov mission was to evacuate unarmed natives from combat areas to assembly points in the rear. From there, women, children, and the elderly were taken to camps in villages with undestroyed houses, where attempts were made to supply them with farming tools as well as a roof. Those forward teams included Nisei, first-generation Japanese-American, interpreters essential for that humanitarian enterprise for reducing native aid to the Japanese 32nd Army. Milgov operations were generally carried out in accordance with orders, which were as charitable as might be expected in wartime, especially against so uncharitable an enemy as the Japanese. Apart from the exceptions of fools and sadists, personnel worked in good faith to ameliorate the harsh conditions of displaced civilians. The relatively few natives willing and able to work for the American 10th Army, chiefly as road labourers and mess and hospital attendants, were paid the going 1940 wage of 1 yen a day, roughly 18 cents. Minimum supplies of food prevented starvation, and potentially destructive epidemic diseases were averted. Many tons of DDT were sprayed around the detention camps against the chronic scourges of mosquitoes, fleas, and flies, while staffs grappled with what one account called the chief discipline problem, getting the elderly women to use latrines. On a personal level, many Americans felt deep sympathy for the desperate Okies and tried to help in every possible way. They were crying and praying, said a young Marine whose platoon shot and killed a lot of civilians the first night. They didn't know where our lines were and we didn't know who they were. I remembered the movies of Japs butchering civilians in China and wondered whether we'd started doing the same. Such men sometimes wept over the bodies of civilians they'd mistakenly killed. They often showed consideration and generosity well beyond the call: medical attention for the wounded, transportation for the aged, rations and candy for the children. 1,000 cans of peaches were spooned into the mouths of native grandmothers. Accustomed to worse from some Japanese and expecting infinitely worse from American beasts, the beneficiaries bowed deeply in gratitude, those who believed the gifts weren't poisoned. On the other hand, Milgov's primary goal was to control an enemy civilian population at minimum cost. "We did not come here to play Santa Claus for the inhabitants of these islands," specified its commander, a brigadier general. "Nor do we intend to raise the standard of their living higher than the pre-war level." Protection meant herding as many as possible, eventually over 250,000, into the extremely overcrowded detention camps, where Okinawans were grateful chiefly because their expectations were so low. For although the War Department recognized that they weren't racially or culturally Japanese, it didn't make the mistake of expecting them to welcome the landing forces as liberators. "But by and large they are still loyal to Japan," its brochure continued. "All they know about Americans is what they get from Tokyo propaganda, so you can expect them to look at you as though you were a combination of Dracula and the sad sack, at first anyway." And for all its good intentions, the brochure's first sentence revealed a smug disregard of what awaited the pastoral island. "There's no use giving you a sightseer's guide," it cheerfully began, "because after the Navy and the Air Forces have blasted the way for a landing, it just won't look the same. This is not to blame those who did the blasting. Anyone about to hit the beach against the expected Japanese resistance deserved every softening-up shell he could get. In that sense, the horrific damage to the island wasn't their fault, but Americans were also badly prepared to deal with their civilian prisoners." "Strange but simple people," a man mused about a grandfather and 2 young children who burst into tears when they thought they were about to be killed. For most Americans in 1945, strange usually came down to being non-American. Still, even the few world travellers couldn't have predicted the power of the Okinawans' fear. Few people take alien ideology or indoctrination seriously, least of all when it seems patently absurd, as in the case of the Japanese anti-American propaganda. But while Americans knew they were the good guys who wished innocent natives no harm, Okinawans, like most people everywhere, believed what they'd been told. The invaders were thirsting to torture, rape, and kill. One of the first groups of prisoners taken on Easter Sunday emerged from a cave, drawing trembling fingers across their throats to indicate they were ready to die. They'd surrendered only because a young woman among them, a student at UCLA who'd been on her way back to Japan when the war broke out, persuaded them that Americans weren't rapacious savages. She happened to be extremely attractive, prompting a private's exclamation of, "Boy, I'd like to fuck her," then his astonishment at her "please don't do that" in perfect English. Sacred Japan was making much of not having lost a war in 2,300 years, and blessed America had never lost one at all. But Okinawans were terrified by this war between the 2 powers that was being waged on their land. An artilleryman correctly observed in April that there are hardly any young men left, only old men, women, and little kids. They were the ones, the scatterings too feeble or immobile to hide or flee the devil, who allowed themselves to be rounded up into the camps. Fighting units began meeting such terrified groups within an hour of the landing, far more of them than anticipated, for the great speed of the advance that bisected the island cut off scores of thousands who had intended to evacuate to the rugged north. The first natives Eugene's sledge saw were pathetic, totally bewildered by the shock of our invasion and scared to death of us, and full of fear, dismay, and confusion on their faces. Aged grandmothers covered themselves head to foot with quilts and shrank deep inside caves. When Americans removed the quilts, the women would kneel and bow their foreheads to the deck time after time, an officer observed. Palms pressed prayerfully together before them, they beseeched their discoverers most piteously to spare their ancient lives. As it advanced a few days after the landing, a Marine platoon was strafing all holes large enough to be cave mouths, then lobbing grenades inside. Just as a member of the platoon was about to blast another such opening, a shrill cry sounded inside. The grenade was held back just in time. 2 cowering young women with children eventually emerged, together with an old man. Bent almost in half, his white beard nearly touching the ground, he supported himself with a staff. A platoon member took him by the arm to lead him to a roundup of civilians they'd just passed, destined for a camp. The old man broke away and shouted in terror to the women. As if the movement had been rehearsed, the 3 dropped to their knees in a neat line, the man using a chopping gesture at the back of his neck to plead for their quick beheading. The memory of a Marine named Peter Milo of the children he encountered continued to haunt him 45 years later. One trembled in his arms. He offered her a candy bar. On L-Day evening, a Connecticut recruit named Irving Ertel dug in near Yomitan Airfield. A sharp-eyed platoon mate spied a Japanese infiltrator with a pack on his back, creeping down a path to their clearing, and killed him with a burst from his Browning automatic rifle, after which the man was discovered to be a woman, her pack a child. That really shook us up. We felt terrible. Then we got used to an awful lot worse. For 3 months from that first night, shooting Okies by mistake was commonplace. The civilians contributed heavily to their own destruction by moving outside American positions at night, although repeatedly warned by leaflet never to do that. But their fear of the daylight blanket of bombs and shells, and of the immensely powerful invaders themselves, caused most to move only at night, and American units, unable to understand why civilians didn't get the vital message, continued firing blindly during that worst time for both. Once one began shooting into the dark, all joined to blast away at any noise in the terrifying dark. In the morning, the perimeter of their night positions had as many dead goats, rabbits, and civilians as Japanese soldiers. Civilians also contributed by helping the Japanese. Each American who saw evidence of that became less concerned about discriminating between Japanese soldiers trying to sneak in and blow them up, and local families trying to save themselves. A few nights later, Oertel's platoon, dug in near the beach, heard movement close by. They grabbed their weapons to defend against the dreaded nighttime banzai attack, until word came down to cease firing because the targets were civilians trying to return to their huts, which the Marines had passed before dark. Needless to say, we didn't cease firing, remembered Platoon Sergeant Edmund DeMar, the pre-war Marine who had wondered where Pearl Harbor was. Because how the hell did we know this? How the hell could anyone be sure they wouldn't banzai and kill us? The morning light revealed a cluster of female corpses mixed in with those of Japanese soldiers. Since some of the women had hand grenades inside their kimonos, the platoon had reason to believe they'd been right to shoot them. But Americans didn't know that civilians often carried grenades for killing themselves to prevent their torture, for which Japanese soldiers had provided the means. Many didn't know what they'd do with them, only hoped a right decision would deliver them at the last moment. But neither could the Americans know, and discoveries of weapons hidden in kimono sleeves helped many resign themselves to dead civilians. Their confusion was reflected in the first letter home of Thomas Hanaher, the young private from North Dakota. The natives, Hanaher wrote during an hour of rest from the push north, don't like the Japs either because they have treated them poorly. But the letter also reported that the natives here are Japs and cannot be trusted. Not entirely true, but true enough for Americans to shoot first and investigate later. Even farmers and fishermen with poles were perceived as threats. The Doberman war dogs of a point squad pushing north along a coastal road on April 10th suddenly froze. Tense Marines heard rustling in the brush only 50 feet away. A glimpse of old-fashioned leggings through the brush told Lieutenant Taylor Kennelly that this was another ambush. "Fire! Fire!" he yelled, and 3 rifles and 1 bar opened up instantly. But female and juvenile screams set Kennelly shouting for the fire to cease. He ran in front of his men, knocking their weapons upward. Rushing into the brush, the men found 3 dead enemy soldiers, 1 live one, and several women and children huddling together. The survivors' eyes bulged with fear until chewing gum, chocolate, and cigarettes were distributed. Kennelly felt relieved when he saw the natives, sensing that his kind young Marines were no murderers of women and children. But a bullet had ripped the arm of an Okinawan boy almost from his body. The bones were in smithereens, the hand gone. Laying the child on a blanket, Kennelly fed him candy from his pack while desperately thinking of what to do. The company doctor was treating casualties far in the column's rear. The squad's medical corpsman had had no training in amputation and wouldn't try on the shattered little arm. Time pressed hard. The point squad was holding up the entire regiment, and the child's wound would kill him very soon. Dismayed, Kennelly decided he himself had to amputate, but could find nothing sharp enough in anyone's pack. Since the child's only prospect was a lingering, agonizing death, the grieving lieutenant, praying for forgiveness from a merciful God, administered an overdose of the corpsman's morphine, then faced the harrowing duty of telling the parents. Late that afternoon, the weary company doctor found Kennelly digging in farther up the coast and told him the child would survive. The doctor had come across the family an hour earlier and amputated the dangling arm. The morphine hadn't killed the lad because it was old and had lost some strength. In fact, it had probably kept him alive by mitigating his shock until the amputation. Kennelly's misery turned to joy. Civilian groups cringed with fear until the barrier was broken, as often with a canteen of water as with a medical dressing or candy bar. Their plight prompted plentiful acts of individual kindness on the part of Americans who had the time and energy for thoughts about outsiders. The happy endings were cherished, especially in the midst of so many horrific ones. What those enormously burdened Americans didn't suspect, even they, who were right there, was the trifling proportion of them. They didn't suspect it because they never saw the civilian majority. For the most part, they encountered only the very young and very old, the barefoot, blind, and crippled who inspired sympathy until the Americans had to duck the next bullet or shell whizzing toward them, the shrunken grandparents and the children with the hungry eyes who prompted fleeting reflections about the oneness of the human family. They rarely met the more or less healthy adolescents and adults with the stamina to avoid the American camps that would have been their best hope for survival, but which seemed to them the worst. Those with the strength ran, limped and crawled to flee everything American, which is why only 126,000 civilians, slightly more than a quarter of the population, were in Milgovt's custody by the end of April instead of the expected 300,000. 40 years later, Taylor Kennelly would often think of the wounded boy, even search for him on a moving visit to Okinawa in 1987. He had no doubt why the child had been spared. My honest conviction is that a gracious God is the giver and taker of life. How dare man assume that he can usurp this power? But in 1945, Kennelly's frightened men, like so many others, would continue firing at movements in the night. One morning, not long after the child's miraculous survival, the same platoon found an entire family dead, including the children. The brave lieutenant's conviction of heavenly intervention doesn't explain why tens of thousands of equally innocent Okinawan children suffered precisely the agonizing death he couldn't countenance for his lucky boy. Many Okinawan civilians had resisted until the last moment the prefectural government's shouts for all non-essentials to evacuate. That last moment came with the arrival of the enemy fleet a week before L-Day. March 24th, the first day of the naval bombardment, choked the roads with traffic, starting at twilight. Scores of thousands felt that anything would be better than the unholy cascade of shells that reinforced the image of the enemy as wild beasts. Throughout that week of pre-invasion bombardment, the central part of the island at night was like a giant ant-hill just destroyed. Bewildered families abandoned their tiny houses, most with nowhere to go and no means of support away from their fields. Some 85,000, about the same number as in the Japanese 32nd Army, headed toward the far, emptier north. Others scattered this way and that, seeking refuge in remote villages, changing directions for some new place glimpsed as a last-minute refuge. Spying sprinklings of refugees 2 weeks later, Ernie Pyle would register Okinawans as dirty and pathetic. Yes, and almost all families were slowed by their aged and infirm. Doubly hard-pressed without their able-bodied men, women lugged all they could, pots and pans, meagre supplies of food, toward the unknown. Many had never seen the villages of their destination. They bore bundles on their heads and infants on their backs, while pushing disabled parents in carts, those lucky enough to have them. When they caught their breath, they tried to calm children whimpering with hunger. Okinawa had an excellent network of poor roads, as an American historian called it. Most were dirt trails for horse-drawn carts. On the east coast, almost directly across the island from the landing beaches, Yoshi Kamata, the wife of a soybean wholesaler, fled with her 5-month-old infant on her back, pulling her 3-year-old with one hand and encouraging her 6-year-old to keep going on his own. Her destination was a village of relatives some 50 miles north, but an hour of staggering revealed the utter futility of her effort. Bravely ignoring his painful feet, the 6-year-old stumbled on in silence, but his baby brother sobbed uncontrollably with fatigue. When they were incapable of another step, their mother panicked until she remembered that a bus went north from a village 2.5 miles ahead. 2.5 miles seemed an impossible distance in the dark, but it was her sole hope of saving her dazed children. She grabbed them and tried to run. Belching smoke from its charcoal engine, the bus was pulling away when Mrs. Kamata dragged herself and her children into the village. To her great good luck, people noticed the family's condition, and although the groaning bus was packed beyond imagination, the driver stopped. The passengers squeezed themselves in even more tightly, and the family was on its way to its relatives, with the kind of luck, Mrs. Kamata soon realized. That separated those destined to perish from those who would survive. The village of Gushikawa, some 7 miles due east of the landing, had been ordered to evacuate much earlier, but the Sonan family remained. Father Tosei Sonan, too, had been lucky until now. The name of his parents' infant son Tosei, who died 4 years before his namesake's birth, had never been removed from the family register. Taken for him, the replacement. Tosei was considered too small and mentally undeveloped. Stupid, the examining officer pronounced, to be conscripted when he was called, 4 years too early. Actually, he was better educated than the average villager because his father, who had failed to amend the family register, was a municipal office worker. Young Tosi took a job in a mainland factory when he could find no work on the island. Since returning, he'd provided for the family relatively well on his fireman's wages. The eldest daughter, having learned in school about subhuman Americans who killed unwanted infants by bashing their heads against a wall, was terrified when the pre-invasion bombardment jolted the island. 11-year-old Shigeko knew all about Americans' determination to destroy and depopulate divine Japan. The little girl was even more terrified on L-Day, when the invaders drove from the beaches on the opposite coast, past Yomitan and Kadena airfields, and straight toward the Pacific coast. The sight of 2 racist killers in a jeep passing Gushikawa caused violent trembling. She escaped the American plane she saw on her way to draw well water 2 days later, only by diving into bushes. The pilot, she was convinced, intended to fire at her. That evening, Father Tosei announced it was time to flee. The family set out after dark with all they could pack into a cart hitched to their horse. With her mother pregnant, Shigeko was treated as an adult who had to care for her 3 younger sisters, aged 6, 4, and 18 months. Her grandfather's former wife, divorced only because she couldn't bear a child to preserve the precious family line, also joined the party. After hugging a neighbor who resolved to remain in her house, the Sonans departed. Terrified to stay, yet unable to accompany them, the old, ill woman who stayed behind embodied the civilian predicament. Flee, stay, fight the incomprehensibly powerful enemy, or surrender to his bestiality. She was the kind most likely to be saved by American Milgauft units. But when her son-in-law, a conscripted soldier, managed to leave his unit for a peek at the house several days later, he found her dead. Weeping evacuees with similar burdens packed the roads leading north. Leaving their home and ancestral tomb, the family hoped their food would sustain them until the Americans were thrown back into the sea. But a bombed-out bridge over a nearby river forced them to unhitch their cart and leave it behind with the bulk of their provisions. Hampered by the slowness of the grandfather's former wife, they followed the East Coast Road, hiding from the bombs and shells at daybreak and moving out again at twilight, as quickly as they could, for Americans were advancing fast behind them. When old grandmother again fell far behind that second night, Shigeko was left to wait for her. Hours later, the 11-year-old decided to go back to look for her. Just as she moved, a bomb or shell exploded in the spot where she'd been standing a second earlier. Grandma was less lucky. Shigeko's long search for her was in vain. Unable to reach their assigned village, the family hid on Mount Tano, one of the North's most rugged and densely wooded mountains. To determine direction, a member had to climb a tree. Dangerous exposure, because Americans often bombed and strafed any little movement. With the family's food almost entirely gone, they killed the horse and dried its flesh for eating. Shigeko's parents said she mustn't cry. She didn't, even when she was starving. What she did do was help hunt for food, which was even more dangerous until nightfall. When the 6th Marine Division declared the North secure on April 20th, its troops really controlled only the towns, villages, and coastal roads, from which patrols were sent into the interior to mop up the Japanese remnants still trying to fight. Looking for food and water from nearby streams, Shigeko and her cousins encountered several enemy groups. When hunger eventually throttled their fear, they accepted chocolate and sea rations, which their parents threw away, convinced anything Americans would give Okinawans had to be poisoned. At last, the famished children risked tasting new gifts on their own. But although they didn't die and some Americans actually seemed kind, Shigeko couldn't forget their lust to kill Asians. Still hiding in remote parts of the lonely mountain, the Sonans and other families built straw huts, then abandoned them for fear they'd be spotted by American patrols. Besides, the proximate food supply, sometimes only boiled grasses and tree bark, was quickly exhausted. Some families prepared to kill themselves to avoid Americans' torture. Others gave up the grim struggle after ventures to villages below, where locals assured them that Americans didn't kill civilians who surrendered, only took them to detention camps. But Tosei Sonan, his fear and loathing of Americans intensified by his years in Japan, remained convinced that any American he approached would shoot him on the spot. Some civilian men had been shot, even though, or just because, they disguised themselves as women. Some women, in turn, cut their hair and dressed like men in the hope of escaping rape, of which there were enough incidents to nourish the fear. One day, 2 patrolling Americans dragged a young woman from a hut they discovered near the Sonans. Shigeko, hiding in a tree, heard terrified weeping while the Americans' backs moved in jerky motions. Together with her parents' constant warnings, the smearing of soot on adolescent girls' faces and their wearing of men's clothes when they left their shelters enabled her to guess what was happening to the woman. Food was a greater problem. When nothing could be scavenged in deserted villages, Tosei sometimes boiled the safe parts of the sotesu, a primitive palm that had kept farming families of earlier generations alive after typhoons destroyed their entire crops. Days were spent high in the mountains, nights in makeshift huts regularly visited by Japanese stragglers, the remnants of Colonel Udo's force, some of whom threatened punishment for failure to supply food. The Sonans had heard they shot some such unpatriotic civilians. At the same time, American patrols continued burning the huts they managed to find. Shigeko and her mother returned from a food foray one morning to find their own hut burned. Picking some charred bits of flesh from the ashes, they wailed for Shigeko's father and sisters, until the dead emerged from the woods demanding quiet, because the patrol that did the burning might still be near. Recovering from their hysterical laughter, the women helped prepare for yet another move. Building and abandoning 13 huts in various forests, they were never dry in that spring's unusually wet, rainy season. A night here, 2 nights there, and a critical debate as they drifted south again in search of sustenance. From a mountain called Onadaika, they saw American ships stretching to the horizon. Perhaps to save the child she was carrying, miraculously not yet lost, Shigeko's mother argued that Japan could never defeat such a force. It was time to give themselves up. Dismissing that nonsense, Tosei Sonan insisted that unconquerable Japanese forces would soon arrive to smash the cowardly Americans and liberate Okinawa. Famished little Shigeko took her father's side because he knew far more about Japan and also because she would never forget her school-learned duty to beat the Americans to death. Now the skeletal children could climb the hills only with desperate effort. A virulent rash with a tormenting itch covered their bodies. In June, although they couldn't be certain of the date, the family staggered to a small mountain somewhere in the south, where no tree remained standing. Japanese corpses sprawled on the blackened stumps, some in bits and pieces. Burying as many as they could, the exhausted Sonans could not dig deep enough to keep the feet from sticking out. The children put crushed leaves in their noses to block the stench when night fell. They had to sleep in the nearest clearing, together with rows of mortally wounded Japanese soldiers, rasping and moaning. When Shigeko's mother gave birth, the Sonans had no idea the battle had been officially over for 2 weeks. The new baby somehow managed to live her first few days, but Shigeko's malnourished, malaria-ridden mother had no milk, and she finally persuaded her husband to surrender. Down from the mountains, the children, all bones and bloated bellies, were loaded onto an American truck, driven to a camp, fed, and sprayed with DDT. 10 months later, they were permitted to return to Gushikawa, which had been burned to the ground, together with their house and all their possessions. Still, the battle was kinder to the Sonans than to civilian Okinawans as a whole. In fact, they were still among the luckiest families. Everyone survived except Grandma and Shigeko's 4-year-old sister, who died days after their flight's end, unable to swallow. For the normal school students turned auxiliary soldiers, L-Day's thrill lasted hours. Senior staff members of the 32nd Army and of the 62nd Division and 5th Artillery Command, coordinator of all heavy artillery, spent much of that long day observing the American Armada from the observation post at Shuri Castle, appreciating the enemy's colossal strength and landing skills, but showing no concern. General Ushijima's smiling composure continued to reflect Japan's invincibility and the Emperor's inviolability. Ota continued believing clever Japanese tactics had lured the invasion fleet to Okinawa, the better to sink it. The confidence of the normal school's complement, all enrolled in the Blood and Iron Scouts, could not have been higher as they took up their tasks.